Hey, it's Mike here, and on this channel I often look at the health effects of plants, and there's one plant in particular with a unique reputation. It's marijuana, or cannabis, and its real health effects seem to be shrouded in myths and mystery, or are often just misrepresented by people with an agenda. So we're going to look at over 20 studies to see which claims of harm or benefits hold up. Like, is marijuana really not addictive? Does the smoke cause lung cancer? We're going to look at studies with measures such as puffs per month. So this is going to be very rigorous. And just to state my position, I don't really benefit from determining that weed is healthy or that it's unhealthy. I'm not like vigorously anti-weed or a stoner, so I just want to know the truth, probably like you. All right, so let's go. To start, marijuana is still considered a Schedule I drug by the DEA, which means it has a high potential for abuse and the potential to create severe psychological or physical dependence. Are they behind the times with this designation? Well, they do use a 90s style gradient on their website logo. So the problem here, though, is that a Schedule I drug is difficult to study. Thankfully, we've had a lot of persistent researchers, so we have a lot of studies to glean information from. All right, we already know that the federal government doesn't like weed. Going through the National Institute of Health's webpage on it, it is clear that their goal is to make weed look bad with only negative statements about it. Their only mention of medical marijuana, for instance, is that it might be creating a false sense of how safe marijuana is. Well, let's see what they have to say about our first topic here, which is, does smoking weed cause lung cancer? Now, most uses of marijuana are in the form of smoking, and the research on this is somewhat conflicting, but despite the NIH generally having a weed is the devil attitude with their write-up on it, they actually go with the National Academy of Sciences 2017 report and state that, quote, researchers so far haven't found a higher risk for lung cancer in people who smoke marijuana. Both of these are pointing to a 2015 study which concluded, quote, results from our pooled analyses provide little evidence for an increased risk of lung cancer among habitual or long-term cannabis smokers. But we need to be level-headed here. Is there really no increased risk for your lungs when inhaling smoke into your lungs? I mean, we're seeing a somewhat increase in cancer in people that just have wood stoves. So what's up? To complete the statement from the study, no increased risk was found, quote, although the possibility of potential adverse effect for heavy consumption cannot be excluded. Yes, in fact, this next study found a twofold increase in lung cancer for heavy weed smokers, and they did adjust for things like alcohol, cigarettes, and socioeconomic status. And here's another study, albeit a smaller study, that found that the group that smoked the highest amount of weed had a 5.7-fold risk for lung cancer. So why is high use, no pun intended, so differentiated from medium or low use? We know that people who smoke tobacco, even at relatively lower amounts, still have an increased chance of lung cancer. It's likely due to the way lower frequency of smoking marijuana cigarettes versus tobacco cigarettes. It can be a few times a month for weed versus about 14 times a day on average for tobacco, which is really high. So the total toxic load for weed is much lower than cigarettes, even if they were to have the exact same effect per cigarette. Do they have the same effect? This brings us to our sort of first official claim, which is that marijuana smoke burns cleaner and therefore is way less dangerous to inhale. Well, I don't know about that. According to this study, quote, both types of smoke contain a complex mixture of compounds, some of which are carcinogenic. They both contain hot gases and irritating particulate matter or tars. In fact, weed in certain cases has higher levels of the carcinogen group polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. However, and this is a big however, it appears that smoking weed might simultaneously exert a pro-cancerous and an anti-cancer effect. It seems to have an impressive resume of cancer murder. Quote, compounds found in cannabis have been shown to kill numerous cancer types, including lung cancer, breast and prostate, leukemia and lymphoma, glioma, skin cancer, and pheochromocytoma. On the other hand, we have nicotine in tobacco, which helps hook cancer up to new blood supplies and helps it spread, while the THC in cannabis actually prevents the new creation of blood cells that fuel cancer. So while tobacco is all bad for cancer, weed appears to be a double-edged sword. However, it is certainly associated with chronic bronchitis and compromises your lungs' immune function. But all of these effects are if it is smoked. What about vaporizing it? Vaping appears to reduce the toxic load of tobacco cigarettes from this study that measured the urinary toxins of vapors versus conventional smokers. Found that in the case of one carcinogen, it removed 97.5% of it. In the worst case scenario for another toxin, it did this. Still pretty good. But has anybody looked at vaping marijuana specifically? Yes, from this study in the Journal of Cannabis Therapeutics, which yes, actually does exist. Using chromatography, they found that 108 out of 111 non-cannabinoid compounds were removed. Yet THC delivery levels remained similar to traditional marijuana cigarettes. And you can also dodge the effect of smoke by eating it, drinking it in sodas, or even brushing it on your teeth. They think of everything. So let's move on to the second topic of psychological effects. Researchers have found an association between schizophrenia and marijuana consumption, which has led some people to say that marijuana is triggering schizophrenia in people that are susceptible. But according to this study that looked at the topic, quote, our results provide some evidence that cannabis initiation increases the risk of schizophrenia, although the size of the causal estimate is small. We find stronger evidence that schizophrenia risk predicts cannabis initiation. As the lead researcher of that study simply put, quote, the evidence suggested that schizophrenia risk predicts the likelihood of trying cannabis. So the jury's still out on that one, but if there is an effect, it is likely weak. At this point, I think it's good to look inside the brain and see what's actually happening when somebody is on weed. Simply put by this study, quote, cannabis acutely raises dopamine levels in the striatum, which is a part of your brain that involves reward. So we need to acknowledge here that despite being on another level, weed is activating the same pathway as meth, for example, increasing dopamine. So how does cannabis do it? Well, THC indirectly increases dopamine by decreasing the amount of GABA, another neurotransmitter which inhibits the release of dopamine, so it just lets more dopamine out there. It's kind of like unscrewing the little mesh top on your salt shaker, but probably a little less intense. We should emphasize that this dopamine spike is not as strong as those hard drugs. From this trial, quote, in the largest data set of healthy participants so far, we provide evidence for a modest increase in human striatal dopamine transmission after administration of THC compared to other drugs of abuse. But let's jump 2 studies back to this one done in 2014. They say that marijuana is not associated with that lower dopamine response, that deadening of the reward system, which is the hallmark of using narcotics. But a few of the same researchers decided to test this out themselves. In this 2016 study, they looked at people who were heavy marijuana users and found that they had a lessened dopamine response. Quote, in conclusion, this study provides evidence that severe cannabis dependence is associated with a deficit in striatal dopamine release. But those very researchers point to how it might be a pre-existing low dopamine response that led these people to self-medicate with weed in the first place. But from this next study, they found that the dopamine response was not lessened in moderate to low marijuana consumers, and that differentiates it from other drugs. However, those who started smoking at a young age did exhibit an altered dopamine process, so that is very much worth noting. With all this information, we have to consider that we are rapidly breeding these plants to increase their levels of THC, and in a recent 30 years, we saw a 6-fold increase in the average THC content of marijuana. Like, if we keep raising the THC content and keep raising it, at some point, it's gonna have an equivalent dopamine spike to hard drugs. All of this brings us to our second claim, which is that weed is not addictive. I'm sure you've heard it 1,000 times. Back to our friends at the National Institute of Health, they just outright call THC an addictive substance. Like, it's addictive, that's that. But from this study, about 9% of cannabis users fit the criteria for addiction to cannabis, and about 25 to 50% of people who smoked daily. This makes it less than half as addicting as alcohol and 1/7 as addicting as tobacco, according to the same study. So I would have to correct this claim by saying that marijuana is not addictive for 91% of people that use it. So we have to ask the question, could it be just addictive for people that already had that compromised dopamine system, or is it taking normal people and making them addicted? Either way, it seems to be a pretty small effect. However, does it lead to more addictive substances? Claim number 3, it is a gateway drug. Its association with other drugs makes Some people say it's a gateway drug, that's it. But there are other factors here. For example, there's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy that since it is illegal, when you have to go to the drug dealer on the corner to illegally buy weed, they are also trying to sell you other illegal drugs in many cases. So we have to ask, if it was legal, would that happen? Probably not. But to be fair, experimenting with one mind-altering substance might encourage you to branch out and experiment with other mind-altering substances. But the most important point here is whether or not you think it's a gateway drug, we seem to treat other substances that are widely considered a gateway drug with open arms, such as alcohol. So let's compare alcohol for a bit. Topic number 3, alcohol versus marijuana. Alcohol is a class 1A carcinogen according to the WHO. Marijuana is not on the list, though it does contain some carcinogens. Again, it contains anti-carcinogenic properties. The net US deaths from alcohol, according to the CDC, are 88,000 per year from a variety of mechanisms, such as heart disease, liver disease, and a variety of cancers. Next, overdosing on weed is still considered impossible. From the National Cancer Institute, quote, because cannabinoid receptors, unlike opioid receptors, are not located in the brainstem areas controlling respiration, lethal doses from cannabis and cannabinoids do not occur. But alcohol poisoning kills 6 people a day in the US, according to the CDC. Can you imagine if weed was killing 6 people a day from overdoses? But what about driving under the influence? This French study collected mandatory urine samples directly after 10,000 fatal accidents. They found a small increase in accidents with weed, which was quite small compared to the alcohol accident rate, but adding them both together, being twisted was the most dangerous. This next study, which controlled for more variables, found no increased risk in accidents for people on weed. However, drunk driving kills 28 people a day in the US, nearly 1/3 of all accidents. Heck, 1 in 4 accidents are caused by cell phones nowadays, so yeah. Then there is the violence, especially towards women, as this study found alcohol consumption was associated with increased violence, end quote. When intoxicated, both men and women behaved more aggressively toward a female target than toward a male target. Yet we just can't say the same for weed, and this is just the tip of the iceberg for negative effects of alcohol. I want to quickly cover a 4th topic, which is marijuana and the youth. This study seems to show that smoking weed when young can lead to a slightly lower IQ. Quote, impairment was concentrated among adolescent onset cannabis users with more persistent use associated with greater decline. While the researchers point to effects like toxic insult to a vulnerable brain, however, it would be dishonest to not at least consider that a lower IQ might simply be associated with a riskier lifestyle, with marijuana as a risk-taking behavior. Association again, I know. Circling back to alcohol for just a second, marijuana consumption is associated with alcohol consumption, and we know that that kills brain cells. Ability to communicate doesn't actually kill brain cells. The marijuana and IQ researchers hypothesize that THC may negatively affect brain development, and many people have pointed to THC in breast milk possibly affecting infants, but we don't have time to get into infants today. That's just one step too far. I will link a resource at least below. Let's move on to the next claim, that marijuana reduces seizures in children. If you have seen the videos on this, you probably already know that this is certainly true.
They couldn't believe it, that there was no epileptic activity on the EEG. So I gave the doctor a hug.
And to back that with this study, 84% of parents reported a reduction in their child's seizure frequency with cannabis. Of these, 11% reported being seizure-free, with 42% having a greater than 80% reduction in seizure frequency. That is huge. While we are talking about miraculous recoveries, we might as well look at motor disease. You may have seen this incredible video floating around.
He used just a single drop, and his hands afterwards were rock steady.
He was just coming back.
And as this study states, quote, a number of preclinical studies in different experimental Parkinson's disease models demonstrated that modulating the cannabinoid system may be useful to treat some motor symptoms. Now, really quickly, I want to cover post-traumatic stress disorder. In Canada, they do supply marijuana to some of their veterans with PTSD, and I have met one firsthand, and they claimed it was hugely beneficial. But what about studies? We actually have one that was recently started that is just the most ridiculous, rigorous, scientific-sounding study ever. It's a placebo-controlled, triple-blind, random crossover pilot study. It's funded by the state of Colorado. We will see. Now I want to cover one final adverse effect of marijuana that sort of captures the hysteria around it, and that is from this study looking at adverse effects. They found that, be warned, be very warned, marijuana can cause, quote, altered judgment, increasing the risk of sexual behaviors that facilitate the transmission of sexually transmitted diseases. Yeah, I can think of a reason marijuana is bad. You might get herpes. Yeah, yes, that's what I said. No study to back that claim, by the way. In summary, it appears that the vast majority of negative effects from marijuana are from heavy smoking. It appears to increase your risk of lung cancer when moderate to low does not. It might mess with your dopamine system. Well, again, moderate to low likely does not. But we can't ignore the anti-cancer effects, and we will definitely see some more research on that in the future. As for our claims, no, marijuana smoke is not magically harmless. In terms of addiction, very mildly addictive, but still potentially addictive. And is it a gateway drug? Probably a bit, but you don't seem to care about alcohol. So in the end, if you're going to be consuming a lot of marijuana, it appears that vaping is by far the safest way to go. Finally, I would say if all this research changed my opinion on the matter, it is simply that there are people in the pro-weed and anti-weed camps that are both just wrong about a lot of stuff. It's definitely a joke to put it as a Schedule I drug when alcohol is not, but it's totally just wrong to say that there are no negative health effects. That's just not correct. But in medical marijuana cases, like epilepsy, for example, it's clear that the positives outweigh the negatives. I wish there was an easy answer, just good or bad, but there's not, sorry. Finally, I'm just mad that making weed illegal means we can't grow hemp, because these headphones should be made out of hemp bioplastic. Everything should be made out of hemp bioplastic. All right, let me know down below if you found any of this information surprising. I sure did. Also, let me know if I missed any major points here. And in case you want to learn more about how plants affect your body, feel free to check out my other videos, subscribe for them in the future. And if you learned anything, if you learned a single fact, feel free to press the like button. All right, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.